Hello.
Hello.
How you doing, Andy?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Doing pretty well. It's a different background for you.
Yeah, I'm not at home. I'm actually at a birthday party.
Oh, really?
It's a kid's birthday party, but I just sneaked away for a while.
Sure. Well, hopefully we can keep it quick and let you get back to it. Hey, Fabio.
Hey, Graham. Hi, Andy.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I had some issues earlier today with my headphones, so I wasn't sure.
So far, so good. Hey, Marshall.
Hey.
Hey, Marshall.
Well, I think we've got a quorum and we are already recording. Also, it's great that the calendar invite worked this time. I went and tried to update the Zoom link to make sure that we had no issues. So looks like it's working out. Well, I will share my screen and then we can start talking through the agenda. All right. So first item, and feel free to add items. I know I'm kind of dominating with the list here, so feel free to jump ahead. And if you have any updates, please do add them. The first thing I want to share is that with Arturo has been on parental leave for some time, and it's felt a little bit like a one-man show in terms of facilitator. The facilitator role, at least officially. I've definitely had people pitching in to help, and like Fabio, I really appreciate you taking on, meeting in my absence. I think Andy, you might have done the same. So I really appreciate everyone's participation. Luke has volunteered to take on the role of facilitator as well, and I think we will have Arturo back soon, but it's going to be great to have all the support that we can. So due to his time zone, it's a little bit challenging for him to show up live on this meeting, and I think this is the time that works for the most people. So he's going to continue to explore how to facilitate a little bit more asynchronously. So you'll see he's got a lot of comments he's adding to issues, and he'll help provide a little more oversight and support where he can. So yeah, if anyone else wants more of an official role, happy to have more people joining in. I by no means mean to run this by myself. Definitely can't do that. So the more the merrier. Okay, next item, I didn't add a link yet, but API gap analysis we were targeting for today. It may be something to revisit if we need to have a little bit more time to get participation, but once we hit that date, I'd like to go back in and evaluate what we've learned so far from those that have participated. Would like to kind of understand the effort to start to address some of these gaps, and then think about how to share this analysis out to more of GitLab. Let's get more of a comprehensive analysis. So I'll pause there. If anyone has any comments, anything that you think that we've learned through this process so far, opportunities to improve how we could just go about identifying gaps. I think it could be laborious for teams to do this. So I'm open to ideas about how to improve that process and make it intuitive enough that we can expand this across GitLab and really get some good insights.
Well, so far from the gap analysis we've done on at least I can speak for the verify endpoint gap analysis, we've noticed that we have scenarios, of course, where the endpoint is implemented in REST, but we are missing either the limitation or the query in GraphQL. Or we also have the other way around. Sometimes it's like intentionally, where certain things are kind of considered internal APIs, and we want only to have them available in REST. But in some cases, it's just like the way are implemented originally in REST, that we never had any use case to convert them into GraphQL, and that could be because the front end is still using data passed through the controller, and if we had reworked that using view components, we would have used like some GraphQL endpoints that at that point implement also the GraphQL queries or mutations. One of the kind of popular use case or gaps that we found was the mismatch in implementation between REST and GraphQL. Could be from minor implementation details where permission checks are done slightly differently among the two endpoints. From that to actually using different logic. In one case, we might use some service object. Another case, we might have a similar implementation, but if we want to fix a bug, it might not be fixed on both sides. So this is a problem with maintenance. And it's kind of a more subtle because it looks like we have logic in both GraphQL and REST, but in reality, these two implementations are different. Yeah, so these are kind of the aspects I've noticed so far.
So thanks for sharing that. I guess one idea is that we could kind of better document somewhere what we're coming across when we're talking about like identifying gaps, and like these are common patterns to be looking for. It seems like some teams who have come across this issue, they don't know where to start. So I think a little bit better guidance on how to get started in doing this analysis and who you need on the team to participate to be able to really get something useful. Maybe there's something there that we could flesh out. Is that kind of what you're thinking there, or is there more on the I don't know, the actual approach when you're technically going through and identifying these issues? Is there more that we can be doing to simplify this process?
Yeah, you mean like how to get other teams to still do this analysis?
Yes.
And try to find it. Yeah, we could probably document some of the findings that we have, maybe with some examples. At least these kind of 3 cases that we found so far, and then encourage to find some other differences. I think it's probably more important at the moment to find these categories of differences rather than which specific endpoints we have problems, and we can still capturing those in more details in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like I was kind of surprised to see it came up in the MR where we're trying to implement the graph or implement the REST endpoints as GraphQL queries, that the way we cache REST endpoint responses would sort of be incompatible with the GraphQL approach. But like the thing that was more interesting to me was like how that's tightly coupled to the REST layer. Like it can't really like even like in principle be used at the like GraphQL resolver level. And moreover, like we have this sort of like layer that the services interface with for doing both like the fetching of the data as well as the like the auth-z part, right? Which like I haven't dug into like how the GraphQL resolver stuff is implemented too much, but like it seems like that logic is just completely, it's not like shared at all, right? So I think that to Fabio's point, it's like identifying these like high level areas where we could consolidate makes a lot more sense than focusing on the individual endpoints, because like, the endpoints are going to change after this analysis is done, right? Like we can't, there's no sustainable way to keep that up to date. So figuring out like where the opportunities for deep consolidation are, and then focusing on that, is the side effect is going to be that we have better coverage on both, I think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I think it's just to note that it's not that the logic is different. We're quite good at least encapsulating our authorization logic in the policies, so we have that defined at least. But it's more that the places where you could put these checks are different. Same thing with caching. The resolvers and endpoints just have fundamentally different phases that they step through. And so the places where we put the same checks are different. That's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, and I think like when we're going to like address these problems, I think it's more important to keep an eye on the future of like where we want to go than like solving the problems that exist with V4 today, right? Because like in the future, I imagine that we would want to define most or all REST endpoints as simple wrappers over the GraphQL implementation, whatever that looks like. And so like, I think we recognize that there's like, especially if we take that like fields include approach that Fabio pointed to in the JSON API specification, like that's going to give us the opportunity to not even have to implement a lot of the endpoints that we have on the REST side today, because you could query the relationships to some extent through the REST API.
Absolutely, and that maps very, very cleanly to concepts in GraphQL. The idea of field sets that you edit. It's, if anything, it's kind of a special case of GraphQL where you have the queries all predefined, but you can choose fields.
And so yeah, all that to say, like I think that like even when we look at like the caching problem and like particularly like the object level caching that the REST API can do, like it's better to think about how we do that on the GraphQL side rather than like how we implement what currently exists in the REST API in the GraphQL translation layer, right? Yeah.
I think if we're talking about, we're not trying to recreate V4, because I think you're right. That's
exactly. That's the gist of what I'm saying. Yeah.
We're trying to aim to converge towards a cleaner, better goal that's good for that we can work all our APIs together with. Because yes, trying to retrofit what everything on to around the idiosyncrasies of what we currently have is just going to be painful, and I don't think we should do that.
Understood. Okay. I guess one comment I would make is the intent, I guess, of the analysis first was that once we do this a single time, that we establish some type of potentially a configuration layer or some kind of programmatic way to see across what we have in REST versus GraphQL, but also I think somehow aligning or syncing this up with what we're actually exposing in terms of features. Like, and I don't think we've talked about how there's not really a good way to do that today. But how will we get insight into features that we're building that don't have APIs unless we start with a manual effort and then start to like define this? Like, it's almost like a way to register these APIs so that we can kind of see them transparently. At least is one thought I've had on this, but I kind of see where you're talking about, like we could fundamentally be changing the technology and how we approach this and how we approach development. So yeah, I don't see the analysis as intended to necessarily go piece by piece and fix everything in V4, but that we kind of get an interpretation of what's there programmatically, so we don't have to do this manually again in the future, which I don't know what that might look like. But yeah, I don't know, any opinions on that, or is that just going the wrong direction? We should be really thinking about a V5. It seems like there's some opinion that we should be focusing on like a V5 version of API and updating, for the future versus touching the existing API. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like in terms of addressing like the things that customers like want, right? Like that, I think the idea that they want parity or more consistency between the REST and GraphQL APIs is like true, but like I think in terms of how we get there, I think we've been focusing on like what we can do to close the gap between the GraphQL and REST APIs in V4, which may solve some customer pain points, but I think we can't really fundamentally address the problems without looking to V5, right? Because what that boils down to is that people want to be able to use the REST API to get access to all the data that they need, right? And right now we have like a bunch of endpoints that exists for various use cases of how people want to query the data. And if we just go down the path of like allowing people to request through the REST API the fields and relationships that they need to fulfill their particular use case, that's a much more general solution, but certainly not something that we could ever even consider implementing in V5 because it's necessarily a breaking change.
In V4.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that like I think what's more important than like the endpoint coverage is like the data models, right? Like nobody wants to have to deal with two different representations of what a merge request is. Whether they're fetching data from the GraphQL endpoint or the REST API, they want that data model to be the same. And certainly it would be much easier from our perspective to come up with these generic endpoints and generic solutions rather than trying to go through piece by piece, I think. Yeah, and I think like if we just like focus on the endpoints that people hit the most frequently, which is easy to get from Elasticsearch, we can make a lot of progress on V5 with I think very few endpoint implementations, especially if they're the types of endpoints that allow people to specify the data that they want returned.
Got it. Well, I think we have an issue for this, which I could probably hunt down pretty quickly.
And I think like from our own perspective, like I think a really good insight here is the fact that like the front end calls the REST API for certain use cases. Like we don't have equivalent GraphQL endpoints, right? So like to me, when we say that we're going to go API first, that should not only mean that we're not doing things in like HAML templates with like server-side rendering and stuff like that, but it should mean that like a GraphQL endpoint exists first and foremost for every single thing, right? And even when we talk about internal APIs, I would love to see us standardize the GraphQL endpoint as the surface area for all internal APIs as well. I think that like if we went down the path that we were talking about doing in that one issue discussion where like we have Workhorse act as the proxy for how these GraphQL requests get translated, the work that we would do there would carry over to things like Gitly and the Kubernetes agent and all these other services that are written in Go that need to make internal API calls. There's no reason why those calls need to be over REST, right? In fact, like we could potentially get like easier code generation and stuff like that by using the GraphQL API instead. So I think like I would like to say that when we say API first, we mean like GraphQL first, and we're going to commit to using the GraphQL API for everything across all of our services. I think that would be a good definition.
Yeah, and I think there's two issues I would point you to. This one is start V5 API. And the other one I would point you to is this one here. And the next bullet, the API vision prioritization. This was my initial kind of stab at this, my initial proposal for how we would prioritize work based on what we've learned from customers, based on the discussion I've been hearing here. So I think if we can take it into those issues, I think definitely in the API vision prioritization issue, I talk about API first and GraphQL first combined. So thinking about if we agree on that, and then also how we execute against that is somewhere I'd like to go next. So maybe we can kind of consider the options and approaches for how to move that forward and really start to break it down.
Does anybody know if, like, for new features, like what types of use cases, if any, we have a tendency to do the like HAML pages thing? Like what types of stuff are we doing that for, like when it's greenfield?
Yeah, I think I can speak for code that I've seen. We tend to build new features using GraphQL first.
Okay.
Yeah, so we tend to say, okay, what does the front end need? And then it needs this kind of data. So let's implement a mutation or GraphQL query, and then front end is built in Vue.js and directly, wherever possible. Or it would be a HAML, but like with some Vue code that calls the API endpoint. And then sometimes we might be able, especially front-end teams might be able to schedule some time to work on technical debt. So some existing HAML templates actually converted into Vue components, and that means that we end up having like a missing GraphQL endpoint for the specific thing. So that we used to have either the controller data or REST endpoint, and now this is the preferred API format is GraphQL, so that we need to cover that gap with GraphQL. So that will be like what the backend will do. So there is a tendency to prefer GraphQL first so far. I haven't seen, unless there's some problems with like a urgency where maybe like front end doesn't want to wait on back end to implement the GraphQL, so we might just do something on the controller directly for the urgency perspective. But like in general, that would be the preferred way to just use GraphQL.
Okay. So basically, like all the HAML stuff where we do like a form post is usually just legacy. Like it's usually just the case because that's the way it's been.
Yeah, primarily would be legacy code.
Okay. So it like shouldn't be like too much of a ask to say that we're going to be strictly GraphQL first going forward.
For this group that we're talking about.
No, I mean just in general, based on what we understand about how people are developing new features.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I think one area where I've seen we might get some feature requests, like from more kind of new endpoint request, will be more from community contributions. Could be either add a new field to an existing REST endpoint, or it would be an endpoint that does that. And then they might submit like a contribution adding a new endpoint. In that case, it's more like, should we tell them to implement the GraphQL first? But then if they need that feature in REST and they don't care about the GraphQL because it's a community contribution, how should we deal with that? This could be maybe kind of connected with the other point, like, should we use the the POC that Alex is working on? Like once it's proven that it actually works, like it works in terms of like a performance and it's a kind of viable solution. Should we use like a solution like that for new endpoints, even if we make them as a V4, well, under V4 path, but they will use like a different mapping, so that in that case it will be easier even for new features that we say, okay, implement the GraphQL and have the REST mapping, and we kind of move towards like anything new has no gaps, shared implementation, and it has this wrapping layer, and anything old is technical that we have to solve, either moving things into V5 is there breaking changes, or we might have cases where something is implemented in GraphQL, but we don't have or already is implemented GraphQL, but we don't have a REST endpoint for that. So maybe we could use the same technique where we make RESTful in that specific path under V4, and now we kind of cover that gap without moving to V5 yet. I think the V5 might be more when.
Yeah, I mean,
something
absolutely.
It's the other way around.
If the aim is to cover gaps quickly, that's good. That's, I think, effective strategy for moving forwards without having to wait for something.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that like if the like we can imagine a future where all V4 endpoints have been rewritten to be like GraphQL wrappers once we like work out all the kinks, right? And then we're not really having to maintain all the like the separate implementation of all the REST endpoints, and it becomes like much easier to like maintain V4 for the next couple of years because we're not really maintaining anything that's like different from what we intend V5 to be, right? It's just like opinionated wrappers around that stuff. That being said, like I'd much like in the cases that are challenging and like for high utilization endpoints that have like very specific performance characteristics that are difficult to meet right now, those are the areas where like I'd rather us focus on like the V5 equivalent or the V5 solve for that, right? And then maybe backport the implementation on the V4 side to a GraphQL wrapper once we have everything sorted out, right? But yeah, I mean, starting with porting existing V4 stuff to GraphQL is also a great way to do like the performance testing that we need to make sure that it works well.
I mean, a big thing that I'm hearing from this is that a lot of these assumptions and it rest on us verifying that this is a viable solution. So the sooner that we can do that, I think the better. I mean, obviously I have my own deliverables and stuff to do. I'm very happy to work on this as a proof of concept and try and get it something that we can test in production out at some point. But it'd be nice to verify that that's something that we think is a priority, and to prioritize that as a key to unlocking all these other strategies. Because if there are in fact other things that are problematic there, then that will change all these other discussions that we're having.
Yep, that's a fair point. So just to kind of summarize, it sounds like, of course, let me say prerequisite here is validating the POC, but that we would say we could focus on the V5 solve for all new efforts, for all new work, new APIs, new features, GraphQL first, API first, and any existing gaps in V4 would be treated as technical debt. We need to validate that this approach works. Maybe you guys can help jump into the notes here and put some meat on the bones here, but does that sound like, am I summarizing that correctly, or am I missing anything critical?
Yeah, and I think specifically what we're saying is that like any new endpoints in V4 should be defined in this GraphQL wrapper layer, right? Like that's really like what we want to get to if after we validate the POC. That way we're not adding more technical debt, right? We're just adding GraphQL queries, and we can ensure that we stop the bleeding in terms of the divergence of the two implementations.
Right.
Yeah, so before we cut V5, we will implement new endpoints using the wrapper in V4. As I say, I'm assuming V5 will have some kind of larger considerations. You know, do we use sparse field set? Do we look at, do we implement the built-in documentation with it? This is kind of a larger kind of a scope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be very important to define what V5 means for us, and
yes.
And we also
why,
like.
I think we will be good to continue, like add new endpoints to V4 until we have very clear specs for V5. And hopefully at that point, then whatever we have implemented with the wrapper in V4 should be identical or very similar to what will be in V5 at that point. The problem will be with existing endpoints that will be a breaking change.
Okay, so I think I need to just flip it around, essentially. As we're adding new features or new endpoints, make sure that they're added to GraphQL first, stop the bleed. We got to validate the POC to make sure this is a feasible solution. And then we'll continue to solve, explore the V5 approach, define that before we start to build any new technology there.
But I think also, like we're saying, after we validate the POC, that we would also go GraphQL first, right? Because in order for new endpoints in V4 to be defined on top of the GraphQL API, you have to implement it in GraphQL first.
Okay, I think this aligns largely with what I have in this proposal issue. I would be helpful if you guys review and let me know if I'm missing it, if I'm off base in that issue. Let's retool it, and I think what's there we could start to push into a blueprint page for how we want to move forward in terms of like API vision. So yeah, take a look at that. I think that lines up. I think the one big question is, where does V5 come in? Like, is there any concrete work yet as a part of this vision? What does that look like? Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
I think we're quite close. I mean, I think the same ideas keep being mentioned again and again.
Right.
So sparse field sets, and being able to include related relation associations, automatic document generation, JSON API conformance, open API schemas. This sort of core set of industry standard stuff. I think once we just work out which of those things we're prepared to commit to, then we've decided what that is, and then when we build forwards, everything's going to be conformed to that. We're going to have nice, and we can. The sooner we can define what that is, the sooner we can start building our first API endpoint under V5.
Yeah.
Great. Yep, I think that makes sense. So I wanted to jump back up to 3 before we close out today. I think one thing I am seeing that is a gap in this issue right now is kind of how we go about executing it. What are some tactical steps we need to take? I think we talked just a little bit about the POC for REST over GraphQL or Raisin. So that's a clear actionable step. I think we can start, like you were asking, Alex, to see how we can get this prioritized, get teams to participate. So I'll make note of that and see how we can start to get some engagement there. But another thought too is if we are looking at motivating teams or defining some best practices for being API first or GraphQL first, I don't think that we've gotten too far into exploring how do we actually do that, which is where I was asking some questions. And Marshall, you raised the same question, is like, where are some cases where we're not already doing that? But that's something I'd like to explore a little bit further, is how do developers make decisions when they're building new features? In what cases are there that we're not using APIs to start with? Or when do we choose REST first? And how do we start to actually make some changes to our documentation or best practices, or is there tooling that we need to provide? I think this POC is part of that, but is there more that we need to provide to developers to essentially define like a golden path or best practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's beautiful about the POC and like the implementation of that, because I feel like those best practices are just the documentation of how to use these annotations that Alex has created on the GraphQL query, right? Like, we should get to a state where, like, if the assumption is that you implement the GraphQL endpoint first, and then if you just follow the conventions that are laid out in that POC, you're good. Like, that is the golden path, and you get automatic Open API schema generation, and you get a REST layer and a GraphQL layer. I think the one question we haven't answered is like, is there ever an instance where you should not create a GraphQL endpoint? I think that it's probably the case for like file uploads and stuff like that. But aside from,
yeah, well, we do support file uploads with GraphQL. The real problem is actually file downloads. So things like the CI trace exports. So streaming large binary responses is actually the biggest issue.
Yeah. And I think that's intuitively obvious to most folks. Like, you know, there's just really no good way to implement that stuff in GraphQL anyway.
Cool. And what about the case where we're building features that are not API first at all, GraphQL or REST? Do we not feel like that's a significant problem, or is there anything that needs to change there?
Yeah, that was basically the question I was posing to Fabio, and generally, like, for new stuff, do we ever see that pattern taking place? And based on what I've seen and based on what Fabio just said, the answer is no, that we don't develop new features that way. I think we just need to say that we don't, and then if there are cases where we still need to for some reason, like, we handle that on a case-by-case basis. But I think it's pretty safe to say that in general, we should never do it that way.
I think it's worth in sort of the medium to far future. I know there's talk about should we move more towards the Rails 7 pattern of doing more of the sort of the hotwire style of HTML over it's more static HTML generation, more server rendering, more hotwire based communication, which actually ends up being less API stuff, because it's all in the Rails app. And if you move towards that sort of that embracing that Rails pattern in the future, there might be some tension there about where we place functionality. I mean, as Marshall mentioned, I think you can actually rewrite your internal services and actual operations in terms of GraphQL, which you call internally anyway. So you can still go through that single pipeline if you want. But it's worth bearing in mind that that's something that is happening in Rails at the moment, and that might, yeah, it's worth just being aware.
And I guess one last question, I'm kind of curious on the integrations team. Do we not see cases where we're not exposing APIs first, or do we feel that we are adequately doing that?
One area that's kind of intermediate is webhooks, which isn't really, well, because of its high structure as something we post out to other people and other people call them to us. It isn't well defined, as we mentioned previously, things like versioning of and schemas for webhooks and things like that. But I'm not entirely sure where it sits in this framework.
Got it. Okay. Well, I know we're a little bit over time, so I won't go much further. I'll make a note of this last bullet. Yeah, I think there are a number of issues still out there that are stale. It would be great to have some more participation across the team, across all of the folks in this group, in the working group. So maybe if you can take a look at issues that are assigned, we can revisit, see if they're still applicable, if we need to adjust priority or reassign. It'd be great to kind of think about what issues we have and how we're progressing those. But yeah, I think a big takeaway, of course, is validating the POC. So I'll make note of that. But let's all work together on how to move that forward. All right. If we didn't touch anything here, feel free to read through the notes. There might be a few bullets that we didn't dive into deeply. But thanks everyone for your time and participation. This is great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
Thank you very much for all your work on this ground. It's been really, really effective as a process.
Thank you. It's great to hear, Alex. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.